The lights of Hollywood have always had a way of deceiving us. They dazzle, they blind, and they convince us that what we are seeing is eternal perfection. For decades, Rita Hayworth embodied that illusion better than almost anyone else. She was the woman on every soldier's wall during the Second World War, the screen siren whose smile promised desire and whose hair fell in waves of impossible glamour. She was Gilda, the love goddess, the icon who made an entire world believe in a fantasy. But what the public could not see, what the cameras refused to capture, was the slow, merciless collapse of the woman behind the myth. The tragedy of Rita Hayworth was not simply that she aged, or that Hollywood moved on to fresher faces. It was that the very life that gave her so much glory also stripped her of everything that was real. 5 marriages, all shattered. A family life built on pain and abandonment. And finally, a disease so cruel that it erased the very memories that had once made her who she was. By the time she died in 1987, at the age of 68, Rita Hayworth had become almost unrecognizable, not because her beauty had faded, but because she had lost herself entirely to Alzheimer's disease. To the world, it looked like alcohol had devoured her, because newspapers preferred scandal over truth. But those who were closest to her knew the truth, that she had spent her final years trapped in a fog, a prisoner inside her own mind. It is impossible to reconcile the Rita Hayworth of the screen, the woman who seemed untouchable, eternal, with the broken figure who ended her days in obscurity. And yet, to understand her story, we must look at both sides of the mirror. We must see her not only as the goddess that Hollywood created, but as the woman who paid the price for that transformation. In the 1940s, she seemed like destiny itself. Born Margarita Carmen Cancino, she remade herself to fit the fantasies of a world desperate for escape. Her hair was dyed red, her Spanish identity softened and rebranded, her very name reshaped into something palatable for Middle America. Hollywood did not just make Rita Hayworth famous, it erased the girl she once was, and in her place, it sculpted a dream. That dream would go on to capture millions. American soldiers carried her pinups into battle. Presidents and princes sought her company. Orson Welles, the genius behind Citizen Kane, called her the most exciting woman he had ever known, and yet even he could not hold her. Neither could the royal Ali Khan, who promised her a life of fairy tale splendor. No man could save Rita Hayworth, because Rita Hayworth was not truly there. She was a projection, an invention, a mask so convincing that even she sometimes forgot who was underneath. The cruelty of her story lies in the way it unfolded. Hollywood gave her everything: money, fame, beauty, desire, and then it left her hollow, abandoned in silence. When the final credits rolled on her career, Rita Hayworth was left to battle not only loneliness but the unrelenting decay of her mind. To the tabloids, she was a drunk. To her family, she was a mother slowly vanishing. And to history, she became a cautionary tale. The goddess who lived too brightly, too beautifully, only to be consumed by the darkness she could never escape. The New York Times once wrote of another fallen star that their life was the slowest suicide in Hollywood history. Rita Hayworth's tragedy was something even more cruel. It was not a suicide. It was not self-destruction. It was oblivion. She did not kill herself. Her memories were stolen from her, piece by piece, until nothing remained but a ghost of the woman the world had adored. And so, when we begin her story, we do not begin with glamour. We begin with silence. We begin with the woman who was once the most desired figure on earth, sitting in a quiet room, unable to remember her lines, her roles, her lovers, or even her own name. That is the paradox of Rita Hayworth. She was immortal on film, yet mortal in every other way. She was eternal in beauty, but fleeting in happiness. To understand the tragedy of Rita Hayworth, we must journey back to the childhood that shaped her, to the dance lessons that broke her feet and her spirit, to the studio contracts that demanded she become someone else, to the marriages that promised salvation but delivered despair, and finally, to the cruel fate that no amount of beauty could resist, the disease that stripped her of everything she once was. This is not just the story of a movie star. This is the story of Hollywood itself, of how the dream factory manufactures goddesses only to discard them when they can no longer shine. Rita Hayworth was worshipped as a goddess, but she died as a woman forgotten by herself. And that is where our story begins. Before Rita Hayworth became Hollywood's love goddess, she was a little girl named Margarita Carmen Cancino, born in Brooklyn in 1918, into a world that demanded discipline long before it ever gave her affection. She was not raised to dream, or to play, or even to choose her own destiny. She was raised to perform. Her father, Eduardo Cancino, was a Spanish dancer whose passion for flamenco burned hotter than any love he ever showed his daughter. To him, Margarita was not a child, she was an extension of his ambition. By the age of 3, he had her on her feet, learning the intricate movements of Spanish dance. By the time she was a teenager, her feet were already scarred from years of rehearsals, her childhood sacrificed to endless practice sessions. There is an image often painted of little girls in pink tutus, spinning with joy across a polished floor. Margarita's reality could not have been further from that dream. Her father drilled her movements with military precision, criticizing, correcting, demanding. He wanted perfection, and in his eyes, perfection meant obedience. He was a man of iron will, and she was his instrument, but beneath that discipline was something darker. In later years, whispers would emerge, painful, haunting allegations that Rita had endured abuse from her father, both emotional and physical. These shadows would never leave her, and they help explain why so much of her adult life was defined by broken trust, failed marriages, and a desperate search for love she could never quite hold on to. Her mother, Rita Hayworth, was of Irish descent, an aspiring showgirl who had once danced in Ziegfeld's chorus line. Volga understood the stage and the lure of performance, but she was softer, more fragile. To her daughter, she was a figure of distant comfort, someone who offered warmth in moments when Eduardo's strict hand grew too heavy. But Volga could not protect Margarita. In a household dominated by Eduardo's will, the young girl's path was sealed. The Cancino family moved to California in the 1920s, chasing work in the growing entertainment industry. By the time Margarita was barely in her teens, she was performing nightly alongside her father in Tijuana nightclubs, places filled with cigarette smoke, gambling, and men who came to drink away their troubles. She was just a child, but under the spotlight, dressed as a woman, she learned quickly that applause could hide discomfort, and smiles could mask pain. Imagine the weight of that reality. A 13-year-old girl forced to dance provocatively for audiences of strangers, her body treated as spectacle, her soul treated as invisible. Margarita was never given the innocence of girlhood. From the start, she was trained to be looked at, not listened to, and in the silence of those smoky clubs, the seeds of her later tragedy were already being planted. Her education was sacrificed for performance. While other girls were sitting in classrooms, Margarita was on stage. She barely made it past junior high school. She could dance with precision. She could smile with allure, but she could not spell with confidence. This lack of formal schooling would haunt her in Hollywood, where scripts often demanded literacy and articulation. Behind the glamorous facade of a star, there would always be the little girl who had been denied her chance to learn. And yet, even in those oppressive beginnings, there was a spark. When Margarita danced, something alive flickered inside her. She could command an audience, make strangers stop and watch. Her father may have controlled her movements, but he could not control the mysterious magic that radiated from her presence. That magic, raw, fragile, and impossible to define, was what Hollywood would later seize upon and transform into stardom. Still, to reach that stage, Margarita first had to endure the brutal reshaping of her identity. Hollywood in the 1930s was obsessed with creating stars who looked American, who fit the fantasies of white, middle-class audiences. To studio executives, Margarita Carmen Cancino sounded too foreign, too ethnic, too other. The name had to go. The hair, dark and heavy, had to be altered. Even her hairline was painfully raised through electrolysis to give her a higher forehead, a look the studios considered more glamorous. And so Margarita was slowly erased. Piece by piece, she became Rita Hayworth. For a girl who had already been molded by her father into something she never chose, this transformation was just another violation. She was never asked who she wanted to be. She was told, she was instructed, and the world applauded when she obeyed. But the tragedy of her origins lies deeper than her lost childhood or stolen name. It lies in the emotional void those years left inside her. Rita Hayworth grew up never knowing unconditional love. She knew discipline, applause, admiration, desire, but not love. And so, for the rest of her life, she chased it. She married 5 times, always hoping the next man would give her the security she had never known, always hoping that the little girl inside her, the child forced to dance in nightclubs, before she could even understand what womanhood meant, might finally be comforted. Of course, that comfort never came. Because how could it? How could a lifetime of absence be replaced by a promise? Rita Hayworth would discover, again and again, that no matter how much the world adored her, she could not escape the loneliness her childhood had carved into her soul. And so, the goddess of Hollywood began her story not with glamour, but with sacrifice. She began not with triumph, but with scars. Scars on her feet from endless hours of dancing. Scars on her mind from a father who used her as a tool. Scars on her heart from a girlhood that was stolen before it ever had the chance to bloom. Those scars would shape everything that followed. They would push her to become a star, and they would pull her toward destruction. They were the invisible lines etched beneath the makeup, beneath the bright red lipstick, beneath the radiant smile that the world could not stop worshiping. Before Rita Hayworth was a goddess, she was a child, and that child was broken long before the cameras ever rolled. By the mid-1930s, the young Margarita Carmen Cancino had all but disappeared. In her place stood Rita Hayworth, a carefully constructed illusion crafted not just by Hollywood executives, but by the machinery of an industry that thrived on reinvention. Yet while the transformation was imposed upon her, Rita embraced it with the quiet resilience of someone who had never known choice. If she was to be a star, then she would be the brightest. Her first years in Hollywood were not glamorous. She worked in B-movies, often as exotic dancers or sultry background figures, roles that emphasized her curves but ignored her depth. To the studio system, she was not yet Rita Hayworth. She was still just another pretty face, a body to fill the screen. But Rita understood something crucial. Survival in Hollywood required patience, and she had already learned patience from her childhood, where endurance was her only escape. The break came when Columbia Pictures took notice. Studio head Harry Cohn, a man notorious for both his ruthlessness and his uncanny eye for potential, saw in Rita a star waiting to be sculpted. Under his watch, her transformation accelerated. Her hair was dyed a flaming red that became her trademark. Her wardrobe shifted from the simple dresses of a nightclub performer to the sweeping gowns of a goddess. Even her diction was retrained, her accent softened, her voice modulated into the silky tones of a leading lady. In 1941, the world began to take notice. Rita appeared opposite James Cagney in Strawberry Blonde, her presence magnetic, her beauty undeniable. Suddenly, audiences were not just watching a supporting player, they were seeing a star. And then came Blood and Sand with Tyrone Power, where she exuded a sensuality that both thrilled and scandalized audiences. Hollywood had found its new siren, but it was not until 1944 that Rita Hayworth became eternal. The film was Cover Girl, a Technicolor musical that paired her with Gene Kelly. The role allowed her to shine not only as a beauty, but as a dancer. Those years of brutal training under her father finally transformed into grace on screen. Rita moved with a fluidity that felt effortless, though it had cost her a childhood. When she smiled, audiences believed it was joy. When she danced, they believed it was freedom. No one knew that behind those movements lay scars and pain. Then came Gilda in 1946, the film that cemented her legend. From the moment she stepped into the frame, tossing her hair back with that famous gesture, Rita Hayworth was no longer just a star, she was a myth. Men adored her, women envied her, soldiers returning from the war carried her image in their hearts, a symbol of desire and escape. The line she delivered, "Me? Sure, I'm decent, but not in this dress," became iconic, embodying the dangerous allure Hollywood had sculpted into her. But with Gilda came a paradox that Rita could never escape. On the one hand, the film gave her immortality. On the other, it trapped her forever in an image she could not live up to. To the world, she was the ultimate seductress, the love goddess, a woman who could melt hearts with a glance. To Rita herself, she was just a girl, still searching for love, for security, for peace. She once confessed, bitterly, "Men fell in love with Gilda, but they woke up with me." It was not just a witty remark, it was the truth of her existence. Hollywood rewarded her fame with adoration but denied her respect as an actress. Critics praised her beauty, her sensuality, her ability to light up the screen. but they dismissed her talent, reducing her to a pin-up, a fantasy, a face. This dismissal hurt her deeply, because Rita longed to be seen not as an image, but as a woman capable of depth and intelligence. Yet, the system that had created her had no interest in that truth. Her personal life during this rise was just as turbulent. In 1943, she married Orson Welles, the boy genius who had revolutionized cinema with Citizen Kane. Together, they seemed like a Hollywood power couple, genius and goddess, mind and beauty. But beneath the surface, their marriage was fraught with conflict. Welles was consumed by his work and his own demons. Rita, already fragile from her upbringing, sought affection and stability he could not provide. Their union, though passionate, was doomed. Still, in those years, Rita was everywhere. She appeared on magazine covers, her face plastered across advertisements, her pin-up image adorning the lockers of soldiers overseas. During World War II, she became more than a movie star. She was a symbol of hope, of beauty preserved in a world drowning in destruction. When men risked their lives on the front lines, they carried her photograph as a reminder of what they were fighting for. Few actresses in history have been so intimately tied to a generation's imagination. But fame is a double-edged sword. The very image that made Rita Hayworth beloved also became her prison. She could not escape the expectations of seduction, the demand for perfection. Every role seemed to require her to be Gilda again, to play the goddess audiences craved, and yet inside, Rita felt smaller, lonelier, more desperate with each passing year. Her rise, dazzling as it was, carried within it the seeds of her downfall, because what Hollywood had built was not a woman, but a myth, and myths are impossible to live with. By the late 1940s, Rita Hayworth was one of the most famous women in the world. She had achieved everything the studio system promised: fame, wealth, adoration, and yet, even at her peak, there were cracks in the facade. Behind the red lips and luminous eyes was a woman already weary, already wounded, already aware that the dream could not last. For now, though, audiences did not see that. They saw only the goddess, the fantasy, the woman who lit up the darkened theaters with the promise of escape. Rita Hayworth had become the dream of millions. What no one yet understood was how much that dream was costing her. By the late 1940s, Rita Hayworth had transcended the ordinary boundaries of stardom. She was no longer just a Hollywood actress, she was a phenomenon, a living embodiment of glamour whose name alone could electrify a marquee. Few stars have ever reached the level of cultural saturation that Rita achieved at her peak. She was not simply famous, she was mythic. Her image was everywhere. In theaters across the globe, audiences gasped when she appeared on screen, her red hair shimmering like fire, her voice low and sultry, her movements charged with a sensuality that seemed both effortless and dangerous. Magazines fought for her covers. Cosmetics companies begged for her endorsement. When she smiled, the world believed in beauty. When she walked into a scene, the screen itself seemed to ignite. Gilda had made her immortal, but it was the years that followed that cemented her as the era's undisputed queen of desire. In 1948, her personal life merged with global headlines when she married Prince Ali Khan, the dashing playboy son of the Aga Khan. The world erupted with fascination. Hollywood's goddess was marrying royalty, an actual prince, a man whose lifestyle was the stuff of fairy tales. The press framed it as the ultimate dream, the screen siren who had bewitched millions now ascending to real-life nobility. Their wedding in Cannes was nothing short of a spectacle. Photographers swarmed the ceremony, capturing images of Rita in a white satin gown, radiant and serene, as if she had stepped directly out of a fantasy. To her fans, this was proof that she was untouchable, that her life was destined to be as enchanted as the roles she played. For a brief moment, it seemed that the girl who had once been forced to dance in smoky nightclubs had truly escaped into a world of castles and crowns. But the truth, as always, was far darker. Ali Khan was a notorious womanizer, incapable of fidelity, and his world of opulence was also a world of isolation. Rita, who had longed for stability, found herself once again abandoned, once again unloved. Though their marriage produced a daughter, Princess Yasmin, it quickly disintegrated under the weight of betrayal and public scrutiny. The fairy tale became another wound, another reminder that the love she sought was always just out of reach. Yet even as her personal life fractured, her professional star continued to soar. She danced with Fred Astaire in You Were Never Lovelier, proving that she could match one of the greatest dancers of all time, step for step. She acted opposite Glenn Ford, Tyrone Power, Cary Grant, Hollywood's most magnetic men, holding her own with an ease that made her seem born to rule the screen. Directors praised her work ethic. Fellow actors marveled at her presence. Rita Hayworth was more than beautiful, she was compelling. She had a stillness, a subtlety, an inner fire that drew the camera to her like gravity. During the height of her fame, Rita became something more than just an actress. She became a symbol of America itself. For soldiers returning from World War II, her pin-up photos had been talismans of hope. For audiences in the post-war years, she represented a nation eager to indulge in fantasy, to forget hardship, to believe once again in glamour. Her face was a promise that beauty and desire were eternal, that there was always something to dream about. But the irony of her fame was cruel. The world adored Rita Hayworth, but very few people ever truly knew her. Strangers saw her as the love goddess, a woman of endless allure. Yet Rita herself once confessed, "I am very shy, and I suffer from an inferiority complex. I have never known happiness." These words, spoken at the very height of her success, reveal the chasm between her public image and her private reality. Behind closed doors, Rita struggled with trust, with loneliness, with the unhealed wounds of her childhood. Fame only amplified her isolation. Every room she entered was filled with men who wanted Gilda, not Rita. Every marriage began with promises that quickly dissolved into betrayal. Every role reinforced an image she could never live up to in real life. Her fame also brought a relentless pressure. Studios expected her to remain flawless, to embody seduction no matter her age, her fatigue, her heartbreak. The public demanded perfection, and Rita delivered it even as it hollowed her out. The more the world adored her, the less she recognized herself. And yet, the paradox of Rita Hayworth's peak is that these years were also her most dazzling. Watch her in Pal Joey, 1957, where she starred alongside Frank Sinatra and Kim Novak, and you see not just an actress, but a queen commanding her stage. Her elegance, her restraint, her aching vulnerability, all of it combined into a performance that shimmered with both beauty and sadness. It was as if Rita herself understood the fleeting nature of her reign and poured that awareness into her roles. By the 1950s, however, cracks had begun to show. Younger actresses were rising. The studio system that had made her a goddess was beginning to crumble, and Rita, exhausted by years of exploitation, scandal, and disappointment, began to fade from the spotlight. She still had the beauty, still had the presence, but inside, the goddess was weary. Still, her peak remains unforgettable. Few stars have ever burned so brightly, so completely, that they seem to define an era. Rita Hayworth was not simply part of Hollywood's golden age. She was the golden age. Her face, her hair, her smile. These were the images that defined glamour for an entire generation. But like all myths, her reign could not last. And as the spotlight began to dim, Rita Hayworth was forced to confront the shadows that had always followed her. The men who betrayed her, the system that exploited her, the loneliness that fame could never cure. At her peak, she was adored by millions. But even then, even in her most triumphant moments, Rita Hayworth remained a woman searching for something the world could never give her. If Rita Hayworth's rise was a fairy tale, then her downfall was a slow-motion tragedy, one that revealed not just the fragility of her own life, but the cruelty of Hollywood itself. The image of the love goddess had made her immortal, but it also trapped her, and as the years moved on, Rita found herself increasingly unable to live up to the fantasy that the world demanded. By the 1950s, her personal life had become a battlefield. Her marriage to Prince Ali Khan, once hailed as the union of Hollywood and royalty, had dissolved in bitterness. His infidelities were legendary, his disregard for her heartbreak almost casual. Rita, once photographed like a queen in Cannes, found herself abandoned and humiliated. Their divorce in 1953 was a public spectacle, another headline that reduced her to scandal rather than humanity. She tried again with marriage, hoping to find the stability she had craved since childhood. In 1953, she married singer Dick Haymes, a man whose charm masked deep financial troubles and violent tempers. Far from offering salvation, Haymes dragged her deeper into despair. He was abusive verbally, sometimes physically, and constantly pursued by creditors. Rita, at the height of her fame, was now being sued by his debtors. The goddess of Hollywood, the woman whose face had been worshipped by millions, was reduced to pawning jewelry to cover the costs of his failures. Their relationship became a grotesque mirror of everything Rita feared: betrayal, exploitation, and humiliation. By the time their marriage collapsed, her trust in men already fragile was shattered almost completely. It seemed that every time Rita reached for love, she found only betrayal. Her professional life suffered alongside her personal turmoil. Hollywood had little patience for women who aged, and even less for women whose private lives bled into scandal. As younger stars like Marilyn Monroe rose to prominence, Rita was pushed aside. Roles became fewer, offers less glamorous. The studios that had once built her image now turned away, chasing fresher faces. Rita's pain, however, ran deeper than fading fame or failed marriages. She was haunted by depression, a lingering emptiness that no applause could fill. She drank, though never with the wild abandon the tabloids claimed. Alcohol became a shield, a way to soften the sharp edges of a life that had given her everything and then stripped it away. Yet to the public, her struggles were evidence of decline. Gossip columns painted her as unreliable, unstable, broken. The world that once adored her now devoured her flaws. In 1958, she married for the fourth time, to producer James Hill. At first, it seemed like another chance, but Hill, too, turned cruel. During a dinner party, in front of guests, he humiliated her so deeply that she broke down in tears at the table. The marriage was poisoned from the start, and by 1961, it ended in divorce. Rita, once again, was left to pick up the pieces of her shattered heart. What made her downfall particularly cruel was how public it was. Every failed relationship, every sign of exhaustion, every rumor of drinking was broadcast to the world. The goddess who had once been untouchable was now reduced to tabloid fodder. To millions, she was no longer Rita Hayworth, the legend, but Rita Hayworth, the scandal. And yet, despite the pain, she never completely disappeared. She kept working, even as the roles grew smaller. Films like Separate Tables, 1958, showed glimpses of her talent, her ability to convey quiet heartbreak with devastating power. But Hollywood's appetite for tragedy is insatiable, and Rita was no longer a fantasy. It had turned her into a cautionary tale. The ultimate cruelty, however, was still to come. By the late 1960s, Rita began to experience something far worse than scandal or fading beauty: confusion. She forgot lines on set. She lost track of conversations. At first, friends and colleagues assumed it was alcohol, another chapter in the narrative the press had written for her. But the truth was far more devastating. Rita Hayworth was one of the first major public figures to suffer from Alzheimer's disease, a condition that was barely understood at the time. Her memory, once filled with scripts, songs, and lovers' faces, began to vanish. She would arrive on set, unable to remember her cues. She would speak in circles, lost in thought. To outsiders, it looked like drunkenness. To insiders, it was something more frightening: the slow erasure of her very self. Imagine the irony. Rita Hayworth, the goddess of the screen, the woman whose very image had been immortalized in film, was losing the one thing no camera could capture: her identity. As Alzheimer's tightened its grip, she became a ghost of herself, drifting further away from the woman she once had been. Her final years in Hollywood were marked by humiliation. Directors complained about her unreliability. Fellow actors grew frustrated with her lapses. Audiences, conditioned to see only perfection, turned away. Rita Hayworth, once the brightest star in the firmament, now flickered in shadows, misunderstood and abandoned. Her downfall was not explosive. It was not a scandalous overdose or a fiery public breakdown. It was slower, quieter, more merciless. It was the gradual fading of a woman whose life had always been defined by being seen, and who now, cruelly, was disappearing before anyone's eyes. And so, by the 1970s, the Rita Hayworth who had electrified audiences in Gilda was gone. What remained was a fragile figure, lost in confusion, her beauty still faintly visible, but her spirit broken. She had been betrayed by men, by studios, by the press, and now, finally, by her own body and mind. The goddess had fallen, not in fire, not in scandal, but in silence. By the 1970s, the woman who had once been the embodiment of Hollywood glamour was fading not from the screen, but from herself. Rita Hayworth's beauty was still visible in her smile, still glimmering faintly in her eyes, but behind the surface a fog was descending. The world saw her stumble, forget, retreat into silences, and it assumed the worst. To gossip columnists, it was alcohol. To the public, it was another fallen star drowning in excess. But to those closest to her, it was something more terrifying. Rita Hayworth was losing her mind. Alzheimer's disease was scarcely understood in those years. Few doctors could diagnose it with certainty, and almost no one knew how to treat it. To outsiders, her symptoms looked like drunkenness or madness. She missed appointments, forgot lines on set, and sometimes failed to recognize people she had known for decades. The woman who had once memorized scripts with ease could now barely hold on to a sentence. Hollywood, impatient and unforgiving, whispered that she was unreliable, difficult, washed up. In truth, Rita was fighting a battle that no amount of willpower could win. Her mind, the very thing that held her identity, was slowly dissolving, and for a woman whose entire existence had been defined by her image, the cruelty was unbearable. She had been sculpted into a goddess by studios, photographed by the world's greatest artists, adored as a fantasy. But now, in her most vulnerable years, she was stripped of even the fragile control she had once had over her life. Her daughter, Yasmin, born of her marriage to Prince Ali Khan, became her anchor. As Rita's illness deepened, Yasmin moved to support her, caring for her with devotion and patience. But even Yasmin could not shield her mother from the public eye. Paparazzi, cruel as ever, stalked Rita in her final years, photographing her as she wandered in confusion, capturing the image of a goddess brought low. The tabloids printed these images gleefully, headlines mocking the decline of Hollywood's once most beautiful woman. It was exploitation to the very end. And yet, in private, Rita's decline had moments of dignity. She found comfort in small routines, in family, in the rare flashes of lucidity that Alzheimer's allowed her. Friends recalled that even as her memory eroded, her sweetness, her gentleness, remained. She would smile, laugh softly, cling to moments she did not fully understand. But the contrast between who she had been and who she had become was almost too much to bear. By the 1980s, her condition could no longer be hidden. In 1981, her daughter petitioned a court to be appointed as her legal guardian, a move that made headlines but was necessary to protect Rita from exploitation. For the first time, the world began to understand. Rita Hayworth was not a drunk, not a recluse, not a scandal. She was ill, very ill, and the disease that consumed her had no cure. The revelation shifted public perception. Sympathy replaced scorn, at least for a time. Alzheimer's, once a hidden and misunderstood affliction, was thrust into the spotlight because of Rita's suffering. She became the unwilling face of a disease that would later devastate millions of families. It was a cruel irony. In her final act, Rita Hayworth raised awareness not through a role, but through her decline. As the years passed, Rita withdrew further. She no longer gave interviews, no longer appeared at premieres. The camera, once her closest ally, had become her enemy. In the quiet of her New York apartment, she lived out her final years, surrounded by family and caregivers. Gone was the red-haired goddess, the screen siren who had once lit up theaters with a toss of her head. What remained was a fragile woman, small and quiet, fading into memory, even as she still lived. In May 1987, Rita Hayworth died at the age of 68. The news shocked the world, though her decline had been evident for years. Tributes poured in, from fellow actors, from fans, from those who remembered the girl who had once danced her way into history. President Ronald Reagan, himself destined to later suffer from Alzheimer's, called her death a tragic loss and praised her courage in facing an illness that had no mercy. Her funeral was a far cry from the glamour of her premieres. There were no flashing lights, no red carpets, no adoring crowds. Instead, there was silence, grief, and the recognition that one of Hollywood's brightest stars had been extinguished. But in that silence, there was also something else. The faint acknowledgement that Rita's life, as tragic as it had been, was more than just scandal. It was a reflection of Hollywood itself, the illusions, the betrayals, the fleeting nature of beauty, and the merciless passage of time. The consequences of her final years extended beyond her own story. Rita Hayworth's battle with Alzheimer's transformed public awareness of the disease, sparking conversations and research that might never have come otherwise. Her suffering became a catalyst for understanding, for compassion, for medical progress. In death, she gave the world something she had rarely been able to give in life: truth. And yet, even with this legacy, the image of Rita Hayworth remains divided. To many, she is still the goddess, immortalized in Gilda, forever tossing her hair back with defiance and allure. To others, she is the fragile figure of her final years, lost in confusion, betrayed by her own mind. Perhaps the truth lies in both. Rita Hayworth was never just a fantasy. She was a woman who danced until her feet bled, who loved and was betrayed, who was worshipped and then discarded, who fought a battle she could never win. Her final years were not glamorous. They were not cinematic. They were human. And perhaps that is where Rita Hayworth's greatest legacy lies. Not in the goddess who bewitched the world, but in the woman who showed us, in her suffering, the cost of being human in a world that worships only perfection. The goddess had disappeared, but the woman, fragile, wounded, unforgettable, remained. When Rita Hayworth was laid to rest in 1987, it was more than the passing of a film star. It was the closing of a chapter in Hollywood history, a chapter written in light and shadow, in desire and despair, in triumph and tragedy. For Rita was not just a product of her time, she was its mirror. And her legacy, decades later, still forces us to confront the question, what does it mean to worship beauty when beauty cannot last? On screen, she remains eternal. Cue up Gilda today, and there she is, tossing her hair, laughing with dangerous charm, inhabiting a role that made her immortal. Her movements are fluid, her gaze hypnotic, her allure unshakable. She does not age, she does not falter, she does not forget. To anyone watching for the first time, Rita Hayworth is alive again, dazzling and invincible. That is the power of cinema, to freeze a goddess in time, untouched by mortality. But to those who know her story, the illusion cuts deeper. Because we know what came after. We know that behind the image of perfection was a woman fractured by childhood scars, crushed by betrayals, and consumed by a disease that stole her identity. We know that the goddess on screen was, in truth, a woman who longed for love but rarely found it. And that knowledge makes watching her films bittersweet, like gazing at a beautiful painting that conceals a wound beneath its surface. Her legacy is one of paradox. To Hollywood, she is still the love goddess, the ultimate fantasy. But to historians, to those who trace the darker currents of Hollywood's golden age, Rita Hayworth represents something far more tragic: the cost of being turned into an icon. She was reinvented, reshaped, renamed, and rebranded until the girl she once was no longer existed. Hollywood gave her immortality, but in exchange, it took her identity. And yet, even in that tragedy, there is something undeniably heroic. Rita endured. She worked. She gave the world performances that still burn with vitality. She raised 2 daughters, both of whom fought to protect her in her final years. She became, unwittingly, a voice for Alzheimer's awareness, her suffering sparking conversations that would later lead to research and compassion for millions. Even as her mind slipped away, her story served a purpose greater than herself. Today, her name is spoken with reverence among film lovers, but also with sorrow. Unlike other stars of her era, Rita Hayworth never found redemption in her later years. She never staged a triumphant comeback, never reinvented herself as a character actress, never enjoyed the adoration of Hollywood in old age. Her life followed a different script, one that ended not with applause, but with silence. And perhaps that silence is what makes her legacy so haunting. For Rita forces us to ask difficult questions. What happens when the world loves an illusion but ignores the person behind it? What happens when beauty, the very thing that makes someone adored, becomes the prison that suffocates them? And what happens when the goddess herself forgets, when Alzheimer's erases the memories of the very life that made her a star? These questions linger, unanswered, because Rita Hayworth's story was never meant to be simple. She was not a morality tale, not a symbol to be neatly packaged. She was a woman who embodied contradictions, shy yet seductive, fragile yet powerful, adored yet abandoned. To reduce her to just the love goddess, is to miss the truth, and the truth is where her legacy truly lies. There is a photograph often cited as one of the last great images of Rita Hayworth. She is older, her red hair muted, her eyes distant, and yet, even in that image, something of the goddess remains, a softness in her smile, a dignity in her gaze, a reminder that beneath the layers of reinvention, there was always a real woman, a woman who deserved love, not worship, a woman who deserved to be remembered not for her decline, but for her courage in enduring it. Her daughter Yasmin once said that her mother was a sweet, gentle woman who never fully realized how much she meant to the world. That may be the most tragic truth of all, that Rita Hayworth herself never believed she was the goddess that audiences adored. Perhaps that is why she remained so elusive, so untouchable. Even in her most intimate moments, she had been turned into a myth, and myths cannot survive reality. And so, Rita's legacy lives in two realms. In film, she is eternal, immortal, forever glamorous. In history, she is tragic, human, unforgettable. Together, these two truths form the portrait of a woman who was both more and less than the goddess we remember. The final question remains: what does Rita Hayworth mean to us today? Perhaps she is a warning that beauty and fame are fragile, and that no amount of adoration can protect the human heart from breaking. Perhaps she is a reminder that the illusions of Hollywood come at a cost, and that every goddess bleeds when the cameras stop rolling. Or perhaps she is simply what she always was, a woman searching for love in a world that only wanted desire. In the end, Rita Hayworth leaves us with silence, a silence heavy with what might have been, a silence that echoes through the decades, reminding us that behind every image on the screen is a life, fragile and fleeting. The goddess is gone. The woman remains, in memory, in film, in tragedy, and perhaps that is her true legacy, not the perfection of Gilda, not the fantasy of the love goddess, but the reminder that every myth is built on a mortal. Rita Hayworth was both myth and mortal, goddess and woman, and in that duality she remains unforgettable.